If you are someone who likes Roman or especially Eastern Roman history, but you also happen to have an interest in data and numbers, then you, like me, will be fascinated by the possibility to look at certain numbers of the Eastern Roman Empire. That incredibly long time span, which fascinatingly is just a bit shorter than the entire timeline of the West. In the previous video, you can watch charts and stats about the Western Roman Empire. But in this video, we're going to do the same for the Eastern Roman Empire, sometimes also called Byzantine Empire, a term which for me only makes sense to be used from the late 7th century AD onwards. So then, let us take a look at some interesting stats and facts about the Eastern Roman Empire's impressive 1123-year-long time span from the opening ceremony of Constantinople in 330 AD to the fall of the same city in 1453 AD. Let us look at some charts of the Byzantine Empire. One, land area. How did the land area of the Eastern Roman Empire evolve over time? That is a question that I have always asked myself, as it would be really interesting to see all the ups and downs over time, the rises, the periods of stability, the sharp drops, and the many rebounds. Almost like a stock market chart of a company that sees a steep rise, but then eventually enters decline and goes bankrupt. We could see the Eastern Roman Empire as an analogous construct, but of course on a much larger macro scale. So let's look at the chart. At the time of the final partition of the Roman Empire, the eastern half was just slightly smaller than the western half, with 2.1 million square kilometers. Of course, this is not an exact number. It should be clear that actually all these numbers are estimates, which I have from scholars who dedicated a lot of time to calculate these values. But still, they are not super precise numbers, of course, so take them with a grain of salt. For a brief while after the partition, the East was gifted the province of Illyricum under Galla Placidia, and then when the West fell, technically, Italy now belonged to the Eastern Roman Empire as well, at least for a brief while. The first greater thing then happened under the reign of Justinian. The Eastern Roman Empire now retook some of the lost provinces of the former Western Roman Empire under the legendary general Flavius Belisarius, and so the size peaked at 2.7 million square kilometers, which is a bit more than half the size of the maximum extent of the Roman Empire in 117 AD, which we remember from the previous video was 5 million square kilometers. And for quite a few decades the size remained stable. Italy now fell to the Lombards not long later, Armenia was lost in 591, but even so, even by 600 AD, a still very respectable area of 2.3 million square kilometers was controlled. So almost 500 years after Trajan, the Roman Empire still had almost half the peak size. Impressive. Which was about the same size as in the early 1st century BC, so a staggering almost 700 years earlier. But then the devastating Persian War came, and immediately afterwards the Muslim Caliphate rose, and so by 700 AD only 1 million square kilometers were controlled, a territory which the Roman Republic had controlled in 133 BC. So the remnant of the Roman Empire had returned to where it had been 833 years before, territory-wise. More territory was lost, and by 900 AD, only 750,000 square kilometers were controlled. But then a big resurgence came under the legendary Basil II. And lo and behold, the Eastern Roman Empire now controlled a staggering 1.35 million square kilometers again, which is as much as the Roman Republic controlled in 100 BC. So the remnant of the Roman Empire had the same size it had 1,100 years earlier. That is absolutely crazy. But then the disastrous Battle of Manzikert came in 1071, and already by 1095 the remnant of the Roman Empire only controlled not even half the size anymore, about 600,000 square kilometers. There was another brief recovery in the second half of the 12th century, where the Byzantine Empire again almost hit, not quite, but almost 1 million square kilometers, but this too was not about to last. After the sack of Constantinople in 1204, it was only 350,000 square kilometers, and in 1400 it was down to 30,000 square kilometers. So we are back now, 1700 years later, where Rome had been around 300 BC. Constantinople fell in 1453 and the last remnant, Vonica, fell in 1479 AD, a full 2232 years after the founding of Rome and 1149 years after the opening ceremony of Constantinople in 330 AD. Rome had come full circle, the size being reduced back to zero, exactly where it had started over 2 millennia earlier. And if you are like me, a total Rome nerd, or Romaboo as some people like to say, and I think that you are, or else you probably wouldn't be watching this video, then you might be interested in the incredible rings and other Roman accessories which the SPQR Shop is building. They make legionary rings, they make rings with different themes, they even make coin replicas, statues, pendants, attributes and terracottas. And the most incredible thing is that they handcraft every single piece. That's right, this is really high quality handcrafted material. There's really no better present for yourself or someone you know who might be a Rome fan. I put the link to their shop in the video description and into the pinned comment, and with this link you can now even get a 20% rebate for every purchase. I repeat, a 20% price reduction for every purchase from the SPQR Shop, which is just an absolutely insane offer, and you can only get it here via the Maiorianus link, because let me tell you, the people from SPQR Shop also are absolute fans of the heroic Emperor Majorian. So go and check out their incredible assortment. There will be certainly also something for you. 2. Army size. So what about the size of the Eastern Roman army? When the West fell, the East inherited almost half of the Roman army, so around 250,000 soldiers in 476 AD. And it has been estimated by Warren Treadgold that the army then would have grown to 380,000 men by 540 AD, the peak of Eastern Roman power. I personally find that number exaggerated. I think 300,000 to 350,000 would be more realistic, but of course we cannot know for sure. Of course we all know what happened next. The plague of Justinian came and the army size declined severely, of course, which is also the reason why events took such an ill turn after the 540s. The army might have dropped to as little as 150,000 to 200,000 men. In the disasters of the 7th century, with the huge losses of territory, the loss of Egypt and the Levant, the army size declined even more, to as low as 129,000. The low was reached in 773 with only around 80,000 men in the middle of the Byzantine Dark Ages. But by around 800 AD, it had started to rise again, to between 90 and maybe even up to 150,000 men. Then of course, during the Byzantine revival period, the army of course increased again. We would again see 148,000 Byzantine soldiers in 959 AD and a staggering 250,000 in 1025. That is truly fascinating. Back to the number where it had been 600 years earlier. This is absolutely crazy. What an extraordinary recovery that was. But unfortunately, it was not to last. After the disastrous Battle of Manzikert and the loss of large parts of Anatolia after 1071, by 1143 already the army had shrunk to 50,000 men and recovered only briefly to 60,000 in 1204. After the disastrous sack of Constantinople of 1204, of course, so would the army shrink, and famously in 1453 there were only about 5,000 Byzantine soldiers left who defended the city. 3. Population of the Eastern Roman Empire. While estimating the land area and army size was already a possibly quite imprecise business, with a lot of guesswork by even the scholars who reconstructed these numbers, sources in the description, you can already guess that population is even harder to estimate. In 395 AD, just before the final split into an Eastern and a Western Roman Empire, the total population was probably 56 million. The Western Empire had 22 million, while the East had 34 million people. The population number largely follows the held territory. So the more territory, the more people of course lived in that territory, and when the Eastern Roman Empire lost lands, so would of course the population shrink accordingly. The peak of Eastern Roman population must have been in 540 AD, with Italy, Africa and southern Spania back under Roman control. The Eastern Roman Empire then probably reached again 40 to 45 million people, as many as in the times of Augustus, more than 500 years earlier. Absolutely impressive. But then of course the huge disasters came, the plague of Justinian which killed millions, and so it is no coincidence that afterwards the empire never really recovered anymore. The population closely follows the territorial chart, of course. And then by 1453, the entire population of the Byzantine Empire was 50,000 people, basically only the inhabitants of Constantinople. By that time, the Byzantine Empire was effectively only that one city. And when the last remnant states fell in the following years, so did the population then of course rapidly decline towards zero, and in 1479 the last remnant state fell. Salve and hello dear friends of late Roman history, it's me Sebastian, the creator and the person behind Maiorianus. As you know, Maiorianus is one of the very few channels on YouTube dedicated only to late Roman history. And as you also know, this is a super niche topic which unfortunately very often doesn't get a lot of love from the YouTube algorithm. I therefore wanted to ask if you could support Maiorianus via a YouTube membership by clicking the join button below the video, or via a Patreon membership, and you can find the link to Patreon in the video description below. Your support and your support only is what makes Maiorianus possible, and I really need your support in order to keep Maiorianus a channel about late Roman history. Thank you again for your support. Majorian himself, I think, would be proud. Bene valete, friends of late Roman history, and back to the video. 4. Entire Roman timeline. We can now do an interesting exercise, if you will, namely plotting the entire 2232 years of Roman history, from the founding of Rome in 753 BC until the fall of the last Eastern Roman remnant state in 1479 AD. Let us plot the land area, army size and population, and marvel at this incredibly long time span and at the many recoveries. We can see the steep loss of territory, army size and population when the Western Roman Empire fell. It fell down a cliff due to bad political decisions, constant civil wars and massive Germanic invasions, and in the time span of only 80 years after the invasions started in 406 AD, it was over. But we can also see the incredible rebound that happened under Justinian, where the Eastern Roman Empire became for a short time, at least on paper, stat-wise similar again to how it had been 560 years earlier under the first Emperor Augustus. But unfortunately, we know that this didn't last long because of a massive plague pandemic that killed millions of Romans, and also there were just too many enemies on all sides, the empire having become dangerously overstretched. And so it quickly fell apart, and we can see that it would take almost half a millennium until the next big recovery, reaching its peak under Basil II in 1025 AD. This was the last peak, and the Roman Empire would never again reach such expansion levels. These charts put everything into perspective and make us marvel at the incredibly long time span of Roman history, its many resurgences, many recoveries, but still then the ultimate downfall. Rise and fall indeed, as we can see. The rise was steep and fast, but the fall took a very long time to play out if we look at the total 2232 year timeline, including the often neglected Eastern Roman Empire as well. And so we can see that exactly like a stock market chart, there was a rise, a plateau, and on the way down many rebounds, bear market rallies if you will, but the Roman bull market had ended in 117 AD, 870 years after the beginning, and the bear market would start, which took over 1300 years to complete. The Eastern Roman Empire had a good run, many impressive rebounds, but we can see that unfortunately it was a continuous trajectory down, and in 1479 AD it was all over. 4. Population of Constantinople. So while Constantinople was still Byzantium, the city had only about 30,000 people living in it. It is quite impossible to know how large it had become when Constantine made it the capital in 330 AD, but it probably had already grown to 100,000 people by then, because many must have followed the emperor to his new capital from Rome and from elsewhere in the entire Roman Empire. By 400 AD, Constantinople had already grown to an impressive 300,000 people, and C.Mango estimated that by the time of Justinian, the city probably had reached 500,000 inhabitants. There was a massive dip in the population due to the plague of Justinian, however the city's population recovered again in the following decades. But then came the Avar Persian siege of 626 and then the loss of the breadbasket Egypt. Similar to Rome's population decline with the loss of Africa about 200 years earlier, so did the loss of Egypt mean that no more grain ships would sail for Constantinople, and so the city's population started declining massively. During these following Byzantine Dark Ages, in 717 AD, the city only had a population of possibly as low as 100,000. But as the empire began to re-emerge, so did the population of Constantinople recover, and amazingly in the 9th and 10th century, this new Rome would even surpass its old peak under Justinian, totaling possibly up to 1 million inhabitants as an upper bound, but more likely around 700,000. The number would then decrease again, but it would stay quite elevated at around 400,000 to 500,000, up to 1204. Then, of course, after that disastrous sack of the Fourth Crusade, the population began to decline. It never recovered from that event, and the population for the next 250 years would hover around 40 to 70,000 people. In 1453, when the city fell, only 50,000 people lived in that formerly glorious capital, and it was not even a real city anymore. We could more accurately call it a collection of villages. The old impressive fora and monuments had almost all been in decay for centuries by that time. But luckily, the city is still standing and has grown so much more since then, and we can even go there and have a look at many of the still standing monuments. A patron of ours, shout out to Justinianus, had the great idea to compare the old Rome and the new Rome, so the population of Rome versus the population of Constantinople over time. You can see Rome in red and Constantinople in purple. We can see impressively that the rise of Constantinople coincided with the demise of Rome. And that is no coincidence. It is a central belief of mine that the shifting of the power base to the east by Constantine doomed the west, and this very fact is impressively visualized in the demise of Rome exactly when Constantinople began to rise. Another interesting thing that we can see is that Rome had a constantly high population of around 1 million people for 400 years straight, with a gradual rise before and a constant decline afterwards. Meanwhile, Constantinople had a wildly fluctuating population, where it would manage to reach 500 to 700,000 inhabitants twice in its history, in the 500s and another time in the 10th to 12th centuries, with a brutal decline in between those two peaks in the Byzantine Dark Ages. It never had such a long, stable continuity as Rome did, which makes sense, since the well-being of the city was very tightly linked with the well-being of the empire, and Rome was never under siege by foreign enemies in an 800-year time span from around 400 BC to around 400 AD. But meanwhile, Constantinople was under constant attack from foreign enemies after 626 AD. This is the tale of the two Romes, the old one and the new one, impressively visualized in one single fascinating chart. And please like and subscribe so that you won't miss any future videos on the fascinating era of the late Roman Empire. And I would especially like to thank our new Sol Invictus supporter, Leo Dei. Thank you so much, Leo Dei, for supporting Maiorianus in such a generous way. Majorian himself, I think, would be proud. And I would of course like to thank each and everyone who is supporting Maiorianus in any form, be it through Patreon, YouTube membership, or through PayPal donations. Thank you for supporting Maiorianus so that I can keep this a channel about late Roman history. And if you want to learn more about Constantinople, you can watch this video in the upper right corner. But if you want to learn more about ancient Rome's incredible population density, you can watch the other video in the lower right corner. I say thanks again to all friends of Roman history, gratias tibiago and bene valete.